Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the origins of arguably the most defining and absolutely the most devastating chapter in American history. We're talking about the Civil War, the conflict that literally tore the United States apart from 1861 to 1865.
To really grasp the gravity of this war, we have to start with the sheer stakes involved. Between 1861 and 1865, an estimated 616,000 to well over 1 million people perished. To put that into perspective, that's hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost to combat and disease, right alongside tens of thousands of civilians and enslaved people. It is, without a doubt, the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. And honestly, the sheer scale of loss was a grim preview of the industrial warfare we'd see in the 20th century.
But beyond that massive casualty toll, the monumental scale of this war completely rewired the nation's DNA. Ultimately, the conflict did two massive things. It preserved the Union, and it led to the abolition of slavery for 4 million African Americans. That's 4 million lives completely changed. The 13th Amendment would eventually rebuild the entire foundation of the country, kicking off the whole Reconstruction era.
So this brings us to the stark contrast, right at the heart of the fracture. On one side, you've got the Northern Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln and eventually commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant. And standing directly against them, the newly formed Southern Confederacy, helmed by its own president, Jefferson Davis, and prominent military figures like Robert E. Lee. These are the opposing titans that directed a war of totally unprecedented scale. So the real question is, how on earth did America actually reach this breaking point?
Let's get into Section 1, the root cause, slavery and the road to disunion.
When you look back at all this, a single, absolutely critical question emerges. Why exactly did the Southern states secede? Now, sure, there's been some debate over the years, but modern historians overwhelmingly agree on the absolute, undeniable centrality of one specific issue, and that's slavery.
Actually, we can just let history speak for itself here. Primary sources, like this incredibly stark excerpt from Mississippi's secession declaration, make the Southern motivation crystal clear. It literally says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." No sugarcoating it. And other seceding states like South Carolina, Georgia, and Texas, they laid out very similar reasons, explicitly citing the Northern movement to abolish slavery as their exact reason for leaving.
But crucially, this wasn't just some overnight fracture. It was the boiling point of decades of controversy. The tension really kicked into gear over the expansion of slavery into Western territories. Essentially, whenever a new state was added, everyone was asking, will it be free or slave? Because that directly impacted the balance of power in the Senate. Add to that the intense backlash over the Fugitive Slave Act, the massive rise of the Northern abolitionist movement, and the slow burn of very distinct white Southern nationalism. And yeah, the pressure had been building for a long, long time. And eventually, all these deeply entrenched political and social tensions finally collided right at the ballot box.
Moving on to Section 2, the tipping point, Lincoln's election and rapid secession.
Just look at how fast these dominoes fell. It's crazy. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican explicitly opposing the expansion of slavery, wins the presidency. Southern leaders absolutely panicked. They were terrified he'd put slavery on a fast track to extinction. So by December, South Carolina says, "We're out," and becomes the first state to secede. By February 1861, and keep in mind this is before Lincoln even takes the oath of office, the Confederate States of America is officially formed by 7 Deep South states.
Now, this is really fascinating. There's a direct, undeniable correlation between a region's enslaved population and how eager they were to secede. Look at the Deep South, where enslaved people made up 47% of the population. They bailed almost immediately. But notice the drop-off. In the Upper South, the enslaved population was 24%, and in the border states, it was just 12%. And those regions, they were noticeably way more hesitant at first. The demographic data literally maps out the political fracture perfectly.
So during this super chaotic window between the election and inauguration, there were these desperate, last-minute scrambles to avoid a war. The most famous was the Crittenden Compromise, which basically proposed bringing back the old Missouri Compromise line and permanently allowing slavery south of it. But Lincoln and the Republicans, they flat out rejected it. Lincoln stood firm, arguing that any compromise extending slavery would eventually just destroy the Union anyway. So the political avenues for peace were essentially slammed shut. And with compromises totally exhausted and 2 separate governments claiming authority over federal property, the fuse was absolutely lit for a military showdown.
Which brings us to Section 3, the final spark, the standoff at Fort Sumter.
The absolute climax of all this tension centered on one place, Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Commanded by Union Major Robert Anderson, the garrison actually moved under the cover of darkness from Fort Moultrie to this heavily fortified island of Fort Sumter. Meanwhile, outgoing President Buchanan kind of just dithered and failed to send any meaningful reinforcements. So, by the time Lincoln finally takes office in March 1861, he gets the news. The fort is completely surrounded by Confederate forces and running dangerously low on basic supplies.
Faced with this literal powder keg, Lincoln plays a calculated masterclass. He orchestrates his response in 4 really precise steps. First, absolutely no recognition of the Confederacy as a legitimate government, so no negotiating treaties. Second, hold on to all remaining Union-occupied forts. Third, attempt to peacefully and without firing a shot provision Fort Sumter with basic supplies like food. And fourth, crucially, he structures this so that if violence does erupt, if a first shot is going to be fired, the Confederacy is going to have to be the one to cast the first stone.
And that carefully measured standoff, it finally broke on April 12, 1861. That was the day Confederate forces officially opened fire on Fort Sumter. The threshold into outright war was officially crossed. Following that attack, this massive, intense wave of enthusiasm for war completely swept over both the North and the South. Military recruitment skyrocketed, and 4 more Southern states quickly joined the Confederacy. The war was on.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're really left to ponder the same profound, lingering question that Lincoln himself asked at the very dawn of the conflict. Can a republic, built by the vote of the people, truly survive an internal attempt to tear it apart? It's a huge question about the absolute resilience of democracy itself. Understanding the meticulous, years-long buildup to this war gives us a pretty stark perspective on just how incredibly close the American Republic came to permanently fracturing. So what do you think? What actually makes a republic endure when its very foundations are so deeply divided?